Hi, I'm Phil. I'm a psychotherapeutic counsellor and a trauma therapist. Today I'm going to talk about the ins and outs of the abandoned character style and how the psychological defences that this character developed to manage their early life situations can influence their behaviours as adults. And then I'll go on to talk about some of the relationship dynamics that this character can find themselves involved in. So, the abandoned character's process is typically one that's adapted to survive abuse, neglect, or abandonment, or the perception that they were being abandoned, which is an important factor to consider because a child might very easily perceive that they're being abandoned when in fact it's just that everyday adult life is just getting in the way of their parents' capacity to be there for them as much as they need. So, we could say that anything that prevents the child getting their early attention needs met has the potential to have a negative effect on their development. And this is because very young children really have no idea of how the adult world works. It's repetition and consistency over a good period of time that teaches them that they are safe and loved and valued. So, if children are brought up in an environment of abuse and neglect, or if parents are inconsistent or unavailable, not necessarily because they're being neglectful or abusive, then these lessons that create security, they just don't get learnt. And the parent doesn't become a stable object that their children can securely attach to and trust. And this can result in some children not developing a thing called object constancy, which is the psychological process that helps a child reassure itself that it is still loved, valued, and wanted, even when their parents aren't there to meet their needs. So, if a child doesn't develop object constancy, then when a parent leaves the room, their belief system, it tells them that that person isn't going to come back or doesn't want to come back because they believe they have no worth to that person. So this means that this child's brain might truly believe that they could die as a result of this person leaving the room. They're biologically programmed to know they need a parent around to survive, so of course they're going to think like this. And how many times are they going to have to experience that terror of death by abandonment if they've no object constancy? So to manage that terror, their process develops defenses to help it cope with the situation. And the lack of object constancy is one of the main traits in the abandoned character style. I've done earlier more detailed videos focusing on object constancy and the other defenses I'll talk about now, which I'll link in the video description below. So, dissociation would be one such defense. And this is when the brain develops the capacity to zone out or detach from negative feelings or experiences of rejection, abuse, and neglect, or anything scary, really. And how long they remain zoned out is going to depend on the individual's need to separate from whatever it is that's too terrible to be conscious of. And how much recall in later life people are going to have about what they've dissociated from in childhood, that's going to depend on the individual too. Another defense strategy, which is also another type of dissociation, is when we learn to racket feelings, which is when our brain develops the capacity to subconsciously swap one emotion for another so we don't have to feel it. And this helps us to manage and remain in denial of feelings that would be just too terrible for us to experience all of the time. But the trouble with this is that the feeling that's brought in to replace the unmanageable one is typically also a negative one, which we're going to feel a lot of course. And this is going to cause another series of problems because we're going to be continuously responding to that emotion as though that's what we should be doing. And when it comes to racketing emotions, the abandoned character typically swaps their childhood terror of death by abandonment or abuse, which is what their brain thought was going to happen to them back then. They swap that terror for shame. So as long as the abandoned character continuously focuses on shame and maintains the belief that their fear relates to a fear of judgment rather than death by abandonment, then they can keep their fear of dying out of awareness. And the abandoned character style can be very efficient at creating shame to maintain this racket. And this is why you'll struggle to find people with abandonment issues who have healthy self-esteem or a positive sense of self. They're just too busy generating shame to mask that fear. If they're too confident for too long, there's a risk of that abandonment terror seeping into their body. So they'll need to devalue themselves or find shame in some way to get that fear at bay. Another defense that's common to the abandoned character style is a process called splitting. And its main purpose in adulthood is to sabotage the possibility of intimacy in relationships. Because to the abandoned person's brain, intimacy with another is eventually going to result in whatever happened to them when they were children. So a splitting process activates to counter the perception of that believed eventuality. And it does this by turning feelings of love or adoration or intimacy it has for another into negative feelings about that same person. So they can separate and avoid from the terrible fate that they're believing that person's going to bring to them. So the secondary purpose for splitting is to enable them to detach from the other without having to feel the true cost of that loss. It's much easier to leave someone you don't like than it is someone you love, and splitting helps them to do that. And the difference between splitting and racketing emotions is that splitting's a defense against intimacy, while racketing feelings helps us to dissociate from feelings in our past. So, another common trait of the abandoned character is to idealize people who they believe can meet their intimacy needs. But once intimacy forms, the splitting process then has to devalue that same person. So, this is likely to create a lot of good partner, bad partner, push pull dynamics in relationships as adults. And then we come to projection, which is another common trait for this character style. So, projecting or fantasizing that people are going to judge, abandon, or treat them like they were treated as children is going to be something they do a lot of because their childhood has taught them not to trust. They actually had those experiences as children, and their brain is on the lookout for that. So, it projects the belief that that's likely to happen again. And projecting that their partners are going to hurt or abandon them is going to invite splitting to occur to manage that perception. Projection's also going to massively assist in the production of shame, because if you're walking around believing that everyone is judging you or projecting that everyone is judging you like you judge yourself, then of course you're going to keep feeling bad about yourself. So in effect, projection and poor object constancy makes it very hard for the abandoned character to rationalize what's truly happening in certain relationship situations. So someone who projects can become very emotional very quickly if their partner's phone buzzes, for example, or if their partner goes to the shop or comes home late from work. And this is because their brain is hyper-vigilantly attuned to anything that hints at them being abandoned, which makes them likely to misinterpret situations and perceive them as being more related to abandonment than they are. And often to counter the projection that others see them as negatively as they see themselves, the abandoned character often mirrors others or adapts to be the person they think the other person needs them to be. So they'll be accepted by the other. But maintaining a sort of false self like this, it takes energy, and they can often end up feeling resentful that they're having to be someone else so people will like them, which might not have been what they needed to do in the first place anyway. And then it comes to transference, which is when feelings related to historical experiences are projected onto people and situations in the present, especially in relationships when their process starts to project the belief that their current partner is going to treat them like they were treated as a child. And when transference occurs, it's likely that splitting will follow. And lastly, we have projective identification, which is a complex defense which enables certain character styles to subconsciously project the unwanted or denied feelings from their childhood into others, and over time influence the other person to start taking on board those feelings as their own. It may sound like a bit like a psychic power, but it's really a subconscious defense that some people can be remarkably good at. But for it to work, they need to find a willing subject who at a subconscious level is willing to accept their feelings and override their own feelings with theirs. So the obvious problem with dissociation, projection, racketing, splitting, adapting, transference, and projective identification is that these defenses were developed in childhood when they were useful for emotional or physical survival. And the trouble is that if we don't develop object constancy, then our emotional system doesn't mature and we won't necessarily grow out of those early defenses as we age. So the abandoned character's dilemma is that they constantly crave the love, consistency, and intimacy that they never got, which subconsciously are the three things that terrify them the most, because to their subconscious, these things equate to the possibility of death by abandonment or abuse. So when it comes to attachment styles, when you first meet the abandoned character, they can often present as having a dependent attachment, as they're likely to go all in with the mirroring of the other and be very needy for contact and attention. They might even become quite obsessed with the person their brain projects is going to meet all of their unmet needs. But due to their object constancy issues, once the relationship becomes more long term or intimate, their splitting processes like to kick in, and their anxious attachment style will then try to gain greater control over the other or push the other away. So at this point, they've switched from dependent to anxious and then finally to avoidant when splitting occurs. And that could all happen very quickly. But the process could also reverse itself just as quickly if the abandoned character starts to idealize their partner again once the intimacy has been sabotaged by the splitting, or if they've managed to gain a level of control over the other by acting out in some way. So, when it comes to making relationship choices, the abandoned character can often be powerfully drawn to a few different character styles. The first two would be the angry character or the perfect character, because these characters typically have avoidant personality styles. And this is likely to be a draw for the abandoned character because to the abandoned character, the other's diminished capacity for intimacy equates to a lack of abandonment risk. Only in reality, it doesn't, because it actually means the opposite, as you're bound to be abandoned or emotionally ignored by someone who is avoidant and lacks the capacity for intimacy. So the abandoned character can repeatedly set themselves up to be abandoned or dismissed by avoidant character types. And this might be a reenactment for them too if their parents had avoidant attachment styles too. It might draw them to those types of people. Another character type they might be drawn to would be the guilty character, whose priority it is to meet the needs of others. So this character is the opposite of the angry and the perfect character, who are largely self-focused. But coupling with the guilty character can create codependency, because the abandoned character, who endlessly yearns for the love and attention they didn't get in childhood, will find a dedicated giver of all this stuff in the guilty character. And the guilty character, who gets their own unmet needs met from childhood by giving to others what they once needed themselves, it's that removes their guilt. They'll find in the abandoned character a wounded soul that is consistently in need of care. But the trouble is that it doesn't matter how good a job they do of rescuing, the abandoned character will always have to push them away or sabotage the intimacy. And each time the abandoned character splits and treats the guilty character badly, they create more shame for themselves, which the guilty character will take responsibility for and work harder to try to help them regulate. So in effect, the guilty character is attempting to give the abandoned character what they are terrified of the most. So it's never going to be a relationship where there's a lot of consistency. And in the end, the abandoned character splitting will invite them to push the other away for good, or they will go and find a better rescuer, or the guilty character will get completely burnt out by trying to meet the impossible needs of the other, and they'll leave. So in relationships, adults with abandonment issues, they need to work to realize that it's unreasonable to expect others to meet their unmet childhood needs, and work towards being able to meet some of these needs for themselves, which is going to be hard because it means they have to work on developing object constancy. And that's going to take time, and they're going to need some help with that. The abandoned character also needs to find ways to reduce their shame, rather than seeking partners who will endlessly feed them reassurance or create further shame for themselves by attaching to people who will devalue abuse or abandon them. They also need to work towards understanding that their projections are not necessarily true, and that feelings generated by racketing, emotions, projection and splitting and transference aren't always facts. That when splitting and transference and projections occur, they will feel like they are. Those feelings are genuine, and that the person they're with is a real threat. But it's likely that they're not. That those feelings aren't actual facts. And most of all, they need to own and accept that what all their defenses are attempting to manage and avoid is something that has already happened to them. They're just terrified of going through it all again, and their defenses are there to prevent that happening. So, like any mental health issue, recovery and progress can be a bumpy road, but that's okay because nobody changes deep rooted coping strategies overnight, and there are no quick fixes for this stuff. But prioritizing raising awareness and self regulation over reaction and believing that projections are factual is usually a good start. So when we're looking at identifying character styles, we need to be mindful that some of the defenses that are often typical to people who've suffered some sort of early abuse, abandonment, or neglect are also going to be shared by other character styles too. But there will typically be certain traits, behaviors, and overlaps that are more pronounced with each style, which makes identification of each carrier little bit easier. But it's not a foolproof system because there are always going to be overlaps with the other character styles. Also, CPTSD and PTSD are both conditions that can quite often develop as a result of early abandonment or neglect, which will be why some people's defenses are more reactive than others. Well, hopefully that was useful for you, and I'll follow this video up with a deep dive into the descriptions of further character styles later. Well, take care and look after yourselves. Goodbye.